Yeah, it is. Okay. So, we have this research on projectification. So we have selected 8 case studies in 4 economic sectors and also professional activities, which is consulting, R&D, the third sector or the social economy, and the artist sector. So we have finished the empirical work, and we are starting to analyze all the data. We have interviews, we have the field work. Yeah, we have a bunch of information. Very interesting that it will be very good to share with you soon, but it's not systematized yet, okay? So I think it will be what I would like to have before, not only to have to publish your view on workspaces and flexibility, but also to have some inputs, of course, for our research now that we are doing the analysis. Okay. Yeah, so maybe maybe we can start with a general question, because what we are studying is to talk about the role that the workspaces have in the organization of work. And I read what you have been writing on workspace and flexibility, so maybe we can start with the general assumption of your view towards it and yeah, and your thoughts about it.
Yes, I mean, with regards to flexibility and the idea of like a workspace, right? Or like, let's say, modes of work, right? So I think it's very interesting because especially here in the Bay Area, the last years I've been focusing a bit on the tech campuses. And what is actually very interesting to see is that um, if we could say these companies that could be argued to a certain way are at the forefront of ways of working and kind of establishing modes of collaborations, it's really following different trajectories. It's not that all together they follow the same kind of path, depending on the company. Some of them really focus on very kind of hybrid models of work, especially after the pandemic. Some others place an emphasis mostly on remote work, and some others they really expect people to be back in the office. And this, of course, has a direct consequence on the way they really inform and they design their actual spaces, right? Their architectures. In the first case, you could see that there is this idea of like almost like a reduction of the amount of square meters they would actually own in the city. In the second case, it's about elimination. You may have read actually that in many cities, especially also in San Francisco, in the city center, there's actually an issue with the central business districts, and actually with the office spaces. And the last case is the ones that they really try to almost like convert their workspaces as palaces, everything included inside, and try to really place somehow everything possible to attract not only current staff to come back to the office, but actually new staff to join the company and get let's say, the best employees and engineers possible to work in these kind of companies.
So it's a
So,
double movement, right?
exactly. I think it's something which for me, I mean, maybe you might have heard that there was this kind of director of the interdisciplinary program at USC, University of Southern California, already in the 70s, in 73, given the fact that in 73 it was the oil crisis, right? So it was really a big issue. It was following the Yom Kippur War, where the Arab countries really placed an oil embargo in certain countries, including the US. So there was really an issue of, okay, how can we rethink work beyond this idea that the employees goes to work, and whether we could imagine it as the work going to the employees, right? So I think this was something which became already since then an issue of concern, but no one could actually embrace because there were not the means so accessible, whether this associates to technologies, whether this associates to ways of controlling the people who are working in an office. How could you check that this person is productive, and how could you check that this person is actually working if it's not in the office and is not supervised? So I would say that the pandemic almost accelerated this transition, something which would already be happening, if you may agree with me. It's just that it happened that it pushed things a bit faster. And these kind of changes that would brought were very often embraced and even kind of pushed forward by many companies. And this is what I think we see here, and I think we see in many places across the world. And of course, this relates to if we go down to the architecture, it associates a lot to the way the space has transformed, right? Now I mean, this idea you mentioned of flexibility, now it almost like goes to every possible level across the space, whether this associates to the program, whether program meaning, this is an office space, for example, or this could be a kind of a space to eat or something. This what is understood as programming architecture, or whether this associates to the structure, whether this associates to the organization of the teams within an office. How do you the management, and what is also fascinating, at least from my point of view, and I don't know if that could be interesting also to you, to see also the role of the architect in this process. Like, who is actually making these changes? Is it the architects themselves who have a very strong saying in this process, or on the contrary, you have certain let's say experts in different kind of areas, whether this is management or whether this is includes, let's say, on almost like different forms of organization of work and recordings and kind of almost like tracing of organizations of work. And to what extent nowadays this trace, something which is very strongly present in the Bay Area, can happen live, can happen in real time. So you could, for instance, you and me could be working, and we could be almost like having a software that detects the way we work, and maybe there's certain things which are not very productive in the way we do it, and how this could become even more productive, this could be even enhanced. But this happens in live mode, in a sense that there is this kind of tracing of our productivity, and this can to a certain extent be even fine-tuned and kind of improved in many different ways. And this also has a consequence to space. Space has the possibility, by being flexible, to constantly reshape in real time, by moving things, by changing things, by introducing new, by removing, so on and so forth.
Yes, and you were talking about this because technology is very important here also, right? For instance, we find um, interviewing people that there are all these tools on project management that do exactly what you say, right? It's like, and they all come from the United States, actually. It's very, yeah, I was just talking with engineers that were telling me that were fascinated with all these tools of daily Scrum and project management and all the new skills, right, that people have to have. So this also has like consequences in various fields, no, of work. Like, what do you think? Like the space, what are like the main spheres where this has consequences? Considering first the organizational ones and organizational work, and then the individual ones.
Yes, I would say that with the rise of post-Fordism, where actually work happens everywhere, we could perhaps argue that the effects of such changes are spreading 24/7 in our lives. It's not that just from our 8-hour shift or X amount of hour shift. So in that sense, it's I think it stretches from the workplace to the house, to the domestic realm, and essentially it would even expand to the strong presence of the digital realm in our lives. So it's not anymore the physical, but also progressively extends to the digital. And I think this is what is also fascinating, because you mentioned about technologies, you mentioned about skill, how to a certain way, certain, let's say, applications or softwares, on one hand, democratize certain things. On the other hand, we could problematize this democratization in a sense, because it takes place to a certain extent and to a certain scale, such a change or such a shift that perhaps could reach a point of almost maybe I don't know if it's right to use that word, but almost become a moment of exploitation to a certain way that like work and kind of, as you say, like this constant presence and constant link to technologies and skills and constant refinement and understanding of ourselves as the entrepreneurs of the self. We have to sell ourselves by knowing all these things, by being able to adapt them. And use them all the time in our lives, becoming strongly present across our lives from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, is whether it's something that it can be understood as being everywhere. That's is not just in a particular kind of a sector or a particular kind of discipline or a particular kind of space.
Yes, and you were talking, Georgios, about the role of the architects and with other people. Can you, I don't know, what do you think is the challenge towards architects? Yeah, we know because architects have always been accused of serving the economic and political power, since
Interests, yes,
it's not
exactly.
it's not a recent thing, of course. But
I
concerning
have,
this
yeah.
this question of the workspace and yeah.
There is a I have to admit that there is a lot of discussions within the academia, but also slowly within practice, of ways to challenge that or to rethink that or to rethink really this kind of approach that architects often have, as more like being the ones to realize certain visions rather than just have a stronger saying sometimes or be participants on the discussion or on the round table. And I happened in the past to participate in certain projects where, in fact, the architects would also become the initiators of these projects. So rather than become the ones who happen to just join in a particular moment in time to just almost execute an idea, of a of someone who of a company or of an individual, rather becomes the ones who really rethink the role and how could the architects become more of an active participant in the shaping of this building or even the initiation of this project. And there's, I think, some quite some examples, I think, progressively across the globe, that really challenge. I don't know if we want to call it like a canon, but more like the way of the traditional way of practicing architecture to a certain way.
Yeah, and so it's like if I understood, it's like are always saying that we just need a program and we can make something. And in this way, you're telling me that they are already also designing the program itself. Is that it?
Yes, and in general, it's instead of just receiving a brief and realizing the brief, is very often becoming almost like engaging in discussions in informing and formulating this brief, and doing so very often from not only let's say a profit-oriented perspective. And what is actually interesting to see here is that in this project that I explained here, like the tech, campuses, to what extent the architects are the same or not, and to what extent, for example, the realization of a building or a project would become the direct, let's say, manifestation of an idea of, let's say, CEO of a tech company, and so on and so forth.
And what do you think are the major challenges or issues that relate with the adaptation and resistance, I don't know, of workers in these transformations that are going on?
Yes, I think this is very interesting because in this article we were discussing, the one on a tech campus here in the Bay Area. It's very interesting to see how already from the 70s there was a process of almost like weakening the power of the workers and this idea of unionization. Because essentially it's by coming together, people get to have a stronger saying or people get to have a stronger power. So by the moment you fragment the things we share and by the things we are essentially, kind of working towards, and each one of us operates as an individual, as a consequence, you have a weaker saying, and on the contrary, you end up in a context where you often have to compete with a person that you could perhaps working together towards something. So it's this idea that we were mentioning before, the entrepreneur of the self, where it has ended up in a situation, I think, where we progressively tend to not come together towards certain aspects, but on the contrary, like perhaps just individualize things and break down to individuals. And this is a process which has started already, almost like 50 years ago.
And you think it's a trend that includes like highly qualified and unqualified workers? But it's
Yes,
different, right?
I think it is a trend which directly associates to the transformation of an economy into a flexible mode of work. We were talking about flexibility. So in fact, by the moment you expect flexibility, you cannot have rigid protocols informing or like, for instance, yes, let's say rigid vectors which are giving direction to certain things. You really need the possibility to adapt to change, given the need to actually be responsive to risks and to uncertainties. And to such an extent, I think it is the case that over the past years, this has been becoming more and more present, more and more kind of visible. And to a certain way, it has been also the defining, let's say, part of today's life, where we are constantly accessible, where we are constantly able to change. You mentioned before the idea of skills, we need to possess more and more skills to be able to adapt to different forms of work, different kind of even kind of spaces, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and now relating to our research, so as I told you, we are discussing the projectification of work, that it's something that it was really like, in the origins, it was the architects who worked by projects, but not anymore, right? So now everybody's working by projects. And how would you relate this new mode of organization and the workspace in itself, considering a project that has a very, lots of times a limited uh, a duration, and it's really it existed in some activities like architecture, but in others, like, I don't know, even the art sector, there were much more permanent structures, but they are not anymore. And the social sector, you keep on having something like, no, a continuous work. And now it's also because of the finance. If you have money from the European Union, you can do it. If not, you can't. So how would you say this? How these relate with workspace design or workspace configuration, talking about projectification?
I don't know if you agree, and if we could imagine this and think of the projectification as also a fragmentation in a certain way, that you tend to break down to smaller pieces, something which could be perhaps be bigger or longer in duration. And this is exactly, I think, associates with the idea of like not only funding, as you say, but the possibility to have, kind of smaller or bigger teams according actually to your needs. And you mentioned before this idea of workers and what could be the changes in the work modes. I think it's this idea of like that you have the core, you have the core in a group. I don't know if this is what also if you agree in that sense or not. And then you have also the periphery, right? You have the people who could like join in a freelance mode of work, in a kind of more like jump in and out in a project in a much easier way than it would normally be in the past. And I have to admit that as architecture, this freelance aspect, or this idea of like jumping in and out of projects and ending up in a context which is very precarious, I have been in the past part of. Maybe we are still part of, and we don't know it that much because we're so much into it. It's just that it has become more and more present in architecture projects. Very often, you may notice that offices invite people to join in an office, or be part of specific projects rather than just join the office permanently. So it's almost like a based on need request, and different to how it used to be, for example, in previous years or centuries, where you would have unskilled labor coming in and just becoming a number nowadays is actually highly skilled labor, which is becomes this kind of just number. It's just the fact that all of us are expected to have a specific amount of qualifications to just even be part of this game, which is very precarious and very, let's say, not permanent, as you call it.
Yes, yes. And would you say there are some differences or similarities concerning these four main domains that we are working on, like arts and culture, R&D, consultancy, and social economy?
I think it's
Oh,
what you mentioned. Maybe they seem unrelated at the beginning, but deep inside, this idea of the project and framing it through the idea of the project that you said, it's a very, very exciting way to reread the commonalities and the common denominators, which are directly, I think, associated also to the modes of economy, and to the modes of actually economy operates nowadays, as you said, associates to funding, associates to skilled labor force, highly skilled very often labor force, and their flexibility to adapt to new projects, to travel across the world, and even nowadays with the digital platforms, even without that, I don't know if it's something which could become relevant is this idea of the rise of the metaverse. Suddenly, everyone could become present in a place with, of course, with a digital kind of copy, if we could say, and not being there. So in a sense, you immediately increase, if we could say, the pool of applicants or the possible participants which could join, and whatever this could associate and what consequences could that have, the fact that you immediately in the past maybe could have been much more difficult to work with someone on the other side of the world, whereas nowadays like us, we can be in the same place in the same time discussing and, very easily in a certain way, right?
here we are.
Yes.
Here we are. Yeah, so you think it's like more like a general uh, um, trend, right? Than something in particular. Well, we found specificities, then we will let you know, right?
Of course, yes, of course, I
Yes,
can
of
imagine.
course. So,
But
so,
yes,
cons-
so sorry,
sorry,
just to
sorry,
say, I
sorry. Go
think
ahead.
this is what you mentioned about this kind of general trend. I think it's more this idea that there is this kind of whereas in the past there really used to be differences, whereas now it's almost like all of us are actually expected to perform having this very roughly the same skills. So we could, for instance, if you are an architect or if you are, I don't know, like as you mentioned, an engineer or a consultant or an artist, in one way or another, it requires this kind of cognitive input that it's somehow in certain kind of knowledge of software, of communication skills, so on and so forth. Which I would argue, yes, that they're very, similar with each other. Of course, in the specificities, I could imagine, as you said, that you may need some more,
Yes.
kind of expertise a certain way,
And would you say also, or would you think that it's interesting? I don't know how the workspace, the consequences it has, but what I also found out, not only in this research but also in the past, is that we talk about flexibility, but at the same time, the modes of work organization become more. How would I say, defined, more, I don't know if rigid it exists in English, but it's like because you have to have like a huge hierarchy, you have to just keep on just registering everything in those tools as I was just talking. Yeah, because there are like 100 tools now, as you said in the beginning when you're mentioning all these tools that we work with, right? And the agenda and everything. So how 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 would you just discuss this, considering flexibility, but at the same time flexibility as a way of getting our work more like rigid, and
No, I think you said it better than I could maybe say it in a sense that flexibility embeds a sense of paradox, that on one hand it can really be liberating, but on the other hand it can really uh, become more kind of restricting to a certain way, you know. So the aspect of flexibility, and this is something which maybe I don't want to say it's a conclusion, but it's one of the remarks actually that I have come up out of my research on the notion and architecture, is that in order to exist, there is a need for certain constraints. There is a need for certain limitations. It cannot be that anything and everything can, you know, can change. It can be modifiable, and you know, there is certain kind of parameters which allow actually for certain things to change. And then, of course, the question becomes, what are the parameters? Who defines these parameters? You know, and so on and so forth. So I would agree with you completely that there is, even though there is this illusion sometimes that flexibility associates to some form of maybe emancipation, some form of kind of freedom, but yes, we could perhaps sometimes problematize that. No, I don't know. I cannot hear you, Luisa. You're on
Yeah,
mute now.
yeah, I was saying that probably is the other way around, and we can see that even in our works at university, right? And also, we were discussing in our team. I don't know if you know that movie that it's called from Farocki. It's called A New Product, where architects are consultants, so they are not designing things anymore, right? So it's also a way of looking at workspaces as yeah, as something, as you were telling, that you are designing the features. Does this raise to your view like ethical concerns concerning the role of architects?
Yes, I mean, I think all of us are, maybe I assume, have this at the back of our minds, you know, to what extent uh, intentionally or unintentionally we inform a particular form of subject or a particular form of life or a particular, you know, kind of um, let's say atmosphere and place of work. And Yes, I would say that at least in my case, uh, I try with the work to unpack those kind of and try to rethink a bit. How could we address this issue? Let's say this way. You know, how could we actually understand what we were saying before? The field of architecture beyond just a person who executes a design brief and doesn't question, challenge, or put forward some perhaps alternatives. You know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And how do you see space as like a mechanism of labor control and how it has influences in power relations? How would you?
Yes, I think it's a direct consequence of that in one way or another. We were talking about this idea of like the transformation of work spaces and how through time there has been certain changes and they have always tried to make and let's say increase the productivity or increase the output. So there has been across different times introduction of certain techniques, certain ways of organizing the space. Uh, so there is for sure a direct association with the the needs to respond, I would say, to not only greater productivity, but to respond to an idea of reducing uncertainty, reducing risk, reducing exposure, and maximizing returns and maximizing a more, let's say, productive environment for the company or for the you know the person who's actually um, contracting a project.
And did you find in your research like forms of resistance to this kind of flexibility in workspaces, or you think people are like accepting everything in a pacific
It's,
way?
I think there is this kind of quality of flexibility, which I think it's very mesmerizing at the beginning. You know, it's very attractive, and you almost fell in love with it. But I think there is a critical point. That's what I have actually figured out discussing with you know friends, colleagues, but also people who have been, kind of working in many of these locations, that during these critical points, people become aware that this flexibility has this kind of twofold role. On the one hand, it really allows you to make your life easier and work a bit more kind of softly, or like according to the way you would like to organize your work. On the other hand, it associates to a continuous relation with work and a kind of impossibility to create a break.
So yeah, because when we think about this figure of like people who have like a desk and a place to stay, people would appropriate itself, right? From the space, like having the picture of the child and everything, like flowers, your own books, and so on. Even in our university now, the building devoted to research is something that you have to book in advance every day, a place to stay. So all these trends are really global, definitely. So it's also, I don't know, like concerning the subjectivities and the self, there is like this lack of appropriation, right, of the workspace. And is do you think this has consequences on your own work and how you subjectively feel about it?
For the examples I've seen, there is hardly, of course, there are some few exceptions, but from the space I've seen, there is this kind of fascination of hot desking, the fascination of constant movement. And it's very often associated to projects. So, for example, let's say you and me work on a project. We will, as long as this project lasts, we will be sitting together or next to each other. As when this project changes, we will be moved to another location. And this often is read by many companies as a attempt to democratize things, as this idea of like, you are not the one privileged because you are sitting next to a window or I am sitting next to the window, but actually it creates a more kind of horizontal way of understanding work. And I think is another thing of what you say. It actually creates at the same time an impossibility to feel a moment of, okay, this is actually my place. This is where, there's a sense of, as you said, appropriation.
Ah, well, there's a lack, no?
Exactly,
There's
the
a,
opposite. Yes, exactly. There is an impossibility to appropriate. And I think
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
this
yeah.
associates directly to the fact that you want to be hyper flexible. You want to be, able to not feel lose any of your flexible qualities, very often associated to the idea of movement, to the idea of like, working with other teams, working on other projects, and constantly kind of being on standby in a way, right?
Yeah. So, like do you think that this way of thinking is also something that the companies and institutions are quite aware of it, and people get convinced, right? Because I don't know how students, it happens like that, right? For them, it's like natural to be exploited, to work in co-working spaces, and then you have to share all your life, all these trends that of course are more general. For instance, for me it's really interesting and also frightening to see that everybody is talking on the phone of their own lives about everything, and how they put like in, in the mobile that everybody knows about your life. So it's a kind of how can we change this, or if it is if we have some expectations of transformation, considering that it's becoming something like natural. Even young generations of people, for instance, activists that I know working in co-work, for them it's something like it is supposed to be like that, right?
Yes, it has become like the new canon, right? It has become this kind of uh, something which is so, as you said, is so natural to us, and this is exactly I think the outcome of this kind of long process that we were discussing before, from the 70s onwards, where there is this increased flexibilization of not only work, but every aspect of our life, leading to a moment where incidents like you describe are actually part of our lives, and there is not any concern about them, you know. And if back to the question, okay, is there a way out? Is there, you know, how could we actually respond to that? I think it's more the idea of becoming aware of it, you know. That's the first step, perhaps, like to really, as you say, that realize that maybe what's happening maybe is not an ideal scenario as we actually understand it, and perhaps we fetishize, you know, but it could be, a different way.
Yes. So I think it's what I wanted to hear from you. Excellent. I don't know if you want to add something.
No, I think it's very exciting, this discussion, because uh, prior to, you know, to your contact a few years ago, and this idea of projectification, I hadn't really uh, conceptualized or given this kind of frame or possibility to think what has been happening through this lens. And I think is extremely relevant, this kind of project, and it's project, and it's just precisely because it has already been part. If we talk about, you know, something being natural, I think this mode of work has been so much embedded into us, and I haven't actually encountered many instances where people have problematized that and have associated, you know, to the modes of work, to the spaces, and so on, to the life, you know, to the way we actually living to a greater extent. So I really look forward to this discussion going, and also to the conference. I mean,
Yes. We could,
since some fragments of this
yeah.
discussion might be online, let's do an even more promotion of that event.
Yes. I keep on resisting calling instead of project, I call it research.
Yes.
It's a way of resisting, right? Yeah, and also the question is that, for instance, we have an excellent team, but you can't give it continuity. And in research, it's the most dramatic thing, I think. It's because you can't create a research group because you don't have people with like tender positions that can be always with us, right?